Good morning. We will start the program in a minute, so please settle down. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mr. Guillermo. I am the secretary of the PNPRS, and I welcome you back again to the plenary hall. I hope you had a refreshing break, and I hope the carbs on carb diet or the carb on carb break is not an impediment to our attention because the next speaker will share to us his reflection on the philosophy of Pope John Paul II. Uh, we will now proceed with the second part of the program, and I hope, again, the energy that the carbs gave us and will provide the energy to listen and learn from the main highlight of our morning session. But before that, let me have the honor of introducing to you our moderator for the first keynote speaker. Our moderator is the vice chair of the PNPRS, and his name is Dr. Blaise Ringar. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our first keynote lecturer, the Most Reverend Dennis Cabañada Villarojo, D.D., Ph.D. Was born on April 8, 1967 in Cebu City. He is a preeminent figure in both ecclesiastical and academic circles. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from San Carlos Seminary in Cebu in 1989, followed by a baccalaureate in Sacred Theology from the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas in 1992. He then earned a licentiate in philosophy from the same university in 1994, and subsequently a doctorate in philosophy from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome in 2001. His coat of arms, Consolamini Populi Meus, Be Consoled My People, reflects both his pastoral and scholarly dedication to be in service of truth himself, who is the ultimate source of consolation. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, Most Reverend Dennis Villarojo, D.D., Ph.D., the Bishop of Malolos. He will be delivering a lecture titled Understanding Human Nature, Intrinsically Structured or Socially Determined. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Good morning to everyone. I will do away with the lesson tree so that we can save time. So the presentation is understanding human nature, whether it is intrinsically structured or socially conditioned. Um, this will have 6 parts, but don't worry, the parts are quite short. The introduction is, of course, the first part, the advent of artificial intelligence and the advocacy to revise the way we look at the human person in view of emancipative goals have once again highlighted the question of human nature. What is the human person, and is there a way by which we could define that which is closest to our own concern, that of our being. This presentation proposes to give the idea of human nature another look, using as starting point the dialogue between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault in November of 1971, moderated by Fons Elders and published in a book entitled The Chomsky and Foucault Debate on Human Nature. The PowerPoint presentation only gives the outline, no? So don't expect anything from there. Yes. It then proceeds to an analysis of the positions taken by both thinkers, noting how the debate touches on the concept of understanding, it being an essential component of human nature. As a catalyst to synthesize the convergences and divergences between the two thinkers, Hans Georg Gadamer's notion of understanding in his phenomenological hermeneutics is brought to the fore, noting how Gadamer's four structures of understanding run tangentially to Chomsky's innate structures as well as to Foucault's social conditions, which shape the way we understand ourselves and our world. Implications are then drawn from the resulting comparison and contrast. Okay. The Chomsky-Foucault debate. As the title of the book indicates, the dialogue is about human nature, and the prologue to the debate by Fons Elders lays down the topic of interest. All studies of man, from history to linguistics and psychology, are faced with the question of whether, in the last instance, we are the product of all kinds of external factors, or if, in spite of our differences, we have something we could call a common human nature, by which we can recognize each other as human beings. That's from Fons Elders. Chomsky points to the fact that a child is presented with a very small amount of data, and yet is able to process them and extend them to a highly articulated and highly systematic, profoundly organized resulting knowledge that he somehow derives from these data. Chomsky assumes that there are somehow innate structures and systems which enable a child to do this. Likewise, Chomsky notes that in spite of differences in experiences over a wide field, individuals can still arrive at systems that are congruent with each other in the sense that what one of them says, the other can understand. This is the emblematic quote that I will repeat many times over from Chomsky. What one of them says, the other can understand. I would like to highlight this fact of understanding, which in actuality is made possible by language, but not only by language, but by the whole set of systems which make possible the event of understanding between two individuals or even among individuals. The innate systems which make this possible, Chomsky identifies as a fundamental constituent of human nature. In fact, the whole mass of schematisms, the organizing principles which guide our social and intellectual individual behavior, that's what Chomsky means to refer to by the concept of human nature. Well, Chomsky locates these systems in the mind as innate, and therefore locating human understanding squarely within the mind, Foucault begs to disagree. He says, and I quote, "To say that these regularities are connected as conditions of existence to the human mind or its nature is difficult for me to accept." End of quote. Instead, Foucault locates these systems outside the mind. He says, "I would like to know whether one cannot discover the system of regularity, of constraint, which makes science possible somewhere else, even outside the human mind, in social forms, in the relations of production, in the class struggles, etc." Chomsky admits that while scientific creation depends on some intrinsic capacity of the mind, there are also social and intellectual conditions that exist which somehow influence the activity. Parenthetically, by creativity, Chomsky does not necessarily mean great scientific discoveries or inventions, but more of the ordinary manner by which we come to understand certain things using the ordinary faculty of reason. Admitting of such historical and social conditioning does not, however, reduce human nature to a purely subjective and changeable reality. As a matter of nature, to a purely subjective, as a matter of biological and anthropological fact, Chomsky insists, the nature of human intelligence certainly has not changed in any substantial way, at least since the 17th century, or probably since Cro-Magnon man. Foucault, however, seeks a risk in defining human nature in a definitive way. He says, if you say that a certain human nature exists, that this human nature has not been given in actual society the rights and the possibilities which allow it to realize itself, doesn't one risk defining human nature, which is at the same time ideal and real, and has been hidden and repressed until now, in terms borrowed from our society, from our civilization, from our culture? End of quote. He cites Marxism as an example whereby at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, human nature is conceived as being alienated from itself, of not having realized the full potential for its development and self-realization. Human nature then is effectively alienated in the capitalist system. This human nature was specifically bourgeois in its self-understanding. Thus, Foucault concludes, it is difficult to say exactly what human nature is. He thus sees in defining human nature in terms of our historical understanding a risk that will be led into error. Now, Chomsky responds at length. Our concept of human nature is certainly limited. It's partially socially conditioned, constrained by our own character, defects, and the limitations of the intellectual culture in which we exist. Yet at the same time, it is of critical importance that we know what impossible goals we're trying to achieve, if we hope to achieve some of the possible goals. And that means we have to be bold enough to speculate and create social theories on the basis of partial knowledge, while remaining very open to the strong possibility and, in fact, overwhelming probability that at least in some respects, we are very off the mark. End of quote. Concerning the concept of human nature, both Chomsky and Foucault centered on the concept of understanding as starting point. Yet they diverge in their approach. For Chomsky, what is vital is the innate systems that allow us to understand each other. For Foucault, the historical and social conditions give us a specific understanding of human nature at each particular epoch as defined by the prevailing economic and social conditions. While Chomsky is open to the external conditions that may determine the way our innate systems work, still, the same systems anchor, in a way, our understanding of human nature, so that he could say, not much has changed in the nature of human intelligence since the Cro-Magnon man. Foucault, for his part, proceeding from his social analysis of historical epochs, views the understanding of human nature as a product of economic and social processes. While Chomsky may describe human nature according to the innate structures that underlie human intelligence, albeit conditioned in part by social and historical processes, Foucault issues a caveat from defining it, since any such definition would be merely drawn from the lexicon of a particular epoch, which may perpetuate within itself the language of an oppressive system. However, these approaches diverge, both fall within the ambit of Hans-Georg Gadamer's phenomenological hermeneutics, in that they both see human nature with the systems that enable us to understand each other, or a self-understanding that the prevailing spirit of an epoch affords us with as modes of understanding. Third part. The concept of understanding enhanced George Gadamer's phenomenological hermeneutics. Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics is not a method of interpretation. It is rather a description of what happens when we understand, if we understand at all. He begins by enumerating the four structures of understanding. I'm going to limit my presentation on Gadamer on just these three concepts, which underlie the fact that we understand. These are prejudices, authority and tradition, and the foreconception of completeness. Number one, prejudices. Gadamer rehabilitated the prejudices from the negative connotation they had for the Enlightenment. It was Descartes who proposed a refoundation of the sciences through a method that sifts through any form of useless presuppositions. Among the empiricists, Francis Bacon enumerated and classified all the spoilers of knowledge in what came down to us as the idols of the tribes. Thus did prejudices attain a notorious reputation for impeding the acquisition of objective knowledge. As Gadamer sees it, however, prejudices did not have their negative connotation prior to Descartes and Bacon. He defines prejudice as judgment that is rendered before all the elements that determine a situation have been finally examined. Originally, therefore, prejudice did not necessarily mean faulty or false judgment. But part of the idea is that it can have either a positive or negative value. Gadamer goes further by highlighting the importance of prejudices as conditions of understanding. At the ontological level, understanding begins with the projection of anticipatory ideas. The recognition that all understanding inevitably involves some prejudices gives the hermeneutical problem its real thrust. The task of hermeneutics, therefore, is to raise to the conscious level the anticipatory ideas, the prejudices which form the four structures of our understanding. Accordingly, methodically conscious understanding will be concerned not merely to form anticipatory ideas, but to make them conscious so as to check them and thus acquire right understanding from the things themselves. Number two, authority and tradition. In his rehabilitation of prejudices, Gadamer asks, what is the ground of the legitimacy of prejudices? To answer this question, he brings up the Enlightenment's distinction between prejudices arising from over-hastiness and those that are caused by the docile submission of human reason to authority. While the former stems from reason's overconfidence of its ability to know, the latter is its surrender to the mind of another. Crucial to this division is reason itself, which may be too over-hasty in its conclusions or too timid to assert its autonomy. Gadamer, however, points out that the prejudice arising from authority can have a positive significance if in the act of submission, reason has evaluated the superiority of authority over itself, that in asserting to the testimony of another, one has carefully evaluated the fact of the other's reliability as a witness or as an expert. Thus, authority can be a legitimate source of knowledge with a proper evaluation of reason. Authority has not to do with obedience, but rather with knowledge. Quote from Gadamer. Reason ultimately is the ground for the legitimation of prejudices, and if it proceeds with deliberation in judging things, it can in fact attain knowledge and understanding by way of the four structures of prejudices. Thus, acknowledging authority is always connected with the idea that what the authority says is not irrational and arbitrary, but can in principle be discovered to be true. Sensitivity to the text, therefore, does not only involve openness to what the text is telling us, but also consciousness of the form meaning we are projecting in the process of understanding. This ultimately entails an acute sense of self and an honest critique of one's beliefs and mental paradigms. Such self-examination will inevitably lead one to the most basic set of beliefs and foreknowledge that one can have, namely the tradition into which one has been born and bred. Tradition, says Gadamer, has an authority that is nameless, and our finite historical being is marked by the fact that the authority of what has been handed down to us always has power over our attitudes and behavior. It is not, however, enough to simply assimilate tradition and to uncritically accept cultural traits and values of a given society as authoritative. Tradition must still be subject to critique and radical examination. For although tradition is an enduring quality which has been tested over time, traumatic events in the past may have caused the formation of some erroneous practices and beliefs, which, if unexamined, will continue to justify certain pathological conditions in a society. Number 3, the foreconception of completeness. Understanding is directed towards the truth of what is said, that is, to the content of the expression. When we try to understand a text, we project upon it a unity of meaning, a context within which the content of what is said can make sense. You recall when old couples talk to each other, they complete each other's sentences. That's the foreconception of completeness. The mind seeks unities of meaning, and only these unities are intelligible. Thus, a text is intelligible only insofar as it is referred to as an intelligible unity. When it does not, however, fit into the projected context, we either revise the context or we begin to suspect the text. Only when Gadamer calls the foreconception of completeness, only when what Gadamer calls the foreconception of completeness fails, do we reflexively move towards understanding the author. He says in Truth and Method, it is only when the attempt to accept what is said as true fails that we try to understand the text psychologically or historically as another's opinion. The prejudice of completeness then implies not only this formal element, but also what it says should be the complete truth. The foreconception of completeness is a prejudice in the sense that whatever is preconceived as complete does not come from the text itself, but is projected by the reader himself, who uses his foreknowledge. Gadamer says, we understand traditionary texts on the basis of expectations of meaning drawn from our own prior relation to the subject. Hence, the most basic of all hermeneutic precondition remains one's foreunderstanding, which comes from being concerned with the same subject. Now, from the 3-4 structures of understanding, we can discern affinities with what Chomsky and Foucault have been discussing in their dialogue concerning human nature. If the human person is a text to be deciphered, the idea of a stable human nature is a foreconception of completeness, which we project not only upon ourselves, but upon others as well. Human nature, to use a Kantian expression, is a regulative concept that allows us to make sense of ourselves and of others. It is that by which we understand ourselves and others as human beings. We project a particular nature on others based on our own experience of ourselves, or more precisely, on our self-understanding. Part 4. Redefining human nature, limits, and possibilities. Foucault's contention that defining human nature risks leading us to error begs the question, if we do not define human nature due to the possibility that we might err, do we not also risk the same error by refusing to define it? I find Chomsky's position in this regard more reasonable. And that means we have to be bold enough, he says, Chomsky. We have the means to be bold enough to speculate and create social theories on the basis of partial knowledge, while remaining very open to the strong possibility that we might be very well off the mark. The idea of human nature is so vital to the way we understand ourselves, as well as to the process by which we are able to understand each other, that defining it is a risk worth taking. This definition, however, cannot be definitive. Since it is our self-understanding, it is socially conditioned. The traditions we come from and the prejudice we pick up along the way shape the way we understand ourselves and others. Some of these traditions and prejudices may have been products of repressive conditions imposed upon us by long-standing structures of domination. Hence, the need to be critical about how and why we have certain fixed and unassailable self-conceptions. These same ideas about ourselves can ossify our creative abilities, subjugating us to ideals that serve only the purpose of those who are in power. Yet up to what extent can we subject our self-understanding to critique, or by what standards can we justify a reinterpretation of human nature? Here, we return to the idea of understanding and to what Chomsky refers to as what one of them says, the other can understand. Human nature is a concept that we project to make sense of our human existence. As projected, it also becomes the basis of human relationships. These relationships are not only interpersonal, but goes all the way to the social, political, economic, moral, religious, even the ecological. The concept of human nature is therefore cardinal for human civilization to either flourish or perish. To the extent that human civilization marches through history, the concept of human nature has also undergone some historic and social revisions. Yet to repeat the question, up to what extent can these revisions go? Up to the point only where we can understand each other as human beings. Beyond intelligibility, there is only anarchy and nihilism. We can subject all authority and tradition to critique, but when we identify structures of domination embedded in them, we can proceed to dismantle them and replace them with social relations that liberate and empower. But when our dismantling invokes the artificial mangling of the most ontologically rooted condition of understanding, for example, language, we risk losing the ground upon which our critique stands. To distort the nature of language itself in the name of revising human nature to suit a particularly preferred reality may result in misunderstanding or the failure of what Chomsky refers to as what one of us says, the other can understand. When language fails to make us understand, or when we intentionally distort the meaning of words, we reduce our speech into gibberish, making our expressions unintelligible or nonsensical. When we create a community that is able to understand such language, we are actually inventing language games that is spoken only by a very narrow community, one that is either excluded by the mainstream or thus the exclusion itself by canceling those who try to push back on its perceived madness. Now, on the question of madness, Foucault insinuates that madness is not a mental issue, but a form of exclusion imposed upon those who do not think like the rest of us. And this fits into this mold of misunderstanding. Chomsky did push back against Foucault's relativization of mental illness. He says, because I think that any human being who is not physically or mentally deformed, and here again I must disagree with Monsieur Foucault and express my belief that the concept of mental illness probably does have an absolute character, to some extent at least, is not only capable of, but is insistent upon doing productive, creative work if given the opportunity to do so. End of quote. The belief that human nature is merely a product of social and economic forces allows us to restructure it according to our vision of how things should be. This is where the technicalization of human nature and the human culture comes in. When we reinvent language and rewire the human body in order to conform to our vision of a brave new world. Gadamer already foresaw this tendency in Reason in the Age of Science, where he wrote, quote, "The old relationship of the product of the arts and crafts with the models furnished by nature has thus been transformed into an idea of construction, into the ideal of a nature artificially produced in accord with an idea." Part 5. Human society, justice or power. One of the most enduring advocacy engaged by human beings is the creation of a just society. For Chomsky, however, the idea of human nature stands at the foundation of an ideal state. Our projection of an ideal justice is intimately wound up with the idea of human nature. To create a just society, there are two intellectual tasks, according to Chomsky. The first is to create a humanistic social theory that is based, if possible, on some firm and humane concept of the human essence or human nature. The second is to understand very clearly the nature of power and oppression, terror, destruction, and destruction in our society. Foucault, for his part, objects to the idea of an ideal justice, saying that the concept of an ideal justice can be an instrument of power. The enforcement of the law, as we have witnessed in societies here and abroad, can be a weaponization of the law. The wide-ranging critique Foucault subjects human history and society constrains him from defining or proposing a particular social theory. He sees instead the immediate and urgent task to be indicating and showing up, even when they are hidden, all the relationships of political power which actually control the social body and oppress or repress it. Foucault does not only see this tendency in the instrumentalities of government, such as the police, the army, and other such state apparatus, but also in the smaller capillaries of power, such as the family, the university, all teaching systems which appear to disseminate knowledge, also institutions of foresight and care, such as medicine and psychiatry. These, according to him, are made to maintain a certain social class in power and to exclude the instruments of power of another social class. Foucault therefore sees the task in terms of class struggle. Seen in this way, the idea of justice becomes a mere expediency to the more important goal of gaining power. He says, unquote, "The proletariat does not make war against the ruling class because it considers such a war to be just. The proletariat makes war with the ruling class because for the first time in history, it wants to take power. And because it will overthrow the power of the ruling class, it considers such a war to be just." And then I think here is a very controversial remark. He says, "One makes a war in order to win, not because it is just." Foucault goes on to say that violence is justified in a class struggle because it is the means by which the victory of the proletariat is sustained and preserved. If the proletariat turns against itself, it is only because it does not gain complete victory, that there are still remnants and pockets of power which need to be done away with in order for the winning class to claim absolute power. Chomsky firmly disagrees with Foucault on these points. However, he makes a qualification to his stance concerning the idea of justice. The aim is not ideal justice, but better justice. He pushes back against Foucault's statement that the idea of justice in itself is an idea which is, in effect, has been invented and put to work in different types of societies as an instrument of a certain political and economic power or as a weapon against that power. Chomsky thus insists that there is some sort of absolute basis, ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities, in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded. He says at length, I think it is too hasty to characterize our existing systems of justice as merely systems of class oppressions. I don't think that they are that. I think that they embody a kind of groping towards the truly humanly valuable concepts of justice and decency, love and kindness, and sympathy, which I think are real. Go now to the last part, human nature, interiority, and transcendence. Foucault's Marxist analysis of the way we conceive justice, and for that matter of human nature, always already militates against social norms. That any social institution is potentially a hotbed of oppression and repression makes it difficult for norms to be validated as truly proceeding from what the human community has discovered over time as the better way of life or the more effective manner of dealing with existential problems and crises in both personal and social life. In Gadamer's account of practice, by which he means the actions which proceeds from a deliberative purpose in human persons to attain social ends, he identifies a need for enlightened choice, just deliberation, and right subordination under common ends. This, in turn, resulted in the greatest achievement for humanity, that is, the stabilization of conduct in terms of right or wrong. Yet under the rubrics of the suspicion of ideology, the same norms could be interpreted as a system of domination. Ethical systems, rules of conduct, can be considered as systems of domination. This system can be embedded in language itself, and the way to overcome it is to bring it to the surface, to conscious critique and unmask the disruptions in understanding and bring about an authentic flow of communication. He says, Gadamer, by reflection, by the completion of enlightenment, and in a conversation free of coercion, the repressions and social deformations would be dismantled. End of quote. Gadamer grants that tradition could be a locus for hidden structures of power and domination. But he also clarifies that tradition is not immune to critique. That it is the locus of understanding does not mean it is the only basis for agreement. Tradition serves only as a source of pre-understanding of our world. It is not above critique, since whatever truth we derive from it is always provisional. In place of universal suspicion, therefore, Gadamer advocates a measure of trust as essential to real conversation. In Gadamerian terms, trust is an essential element of goodwill. That is, one must be open to the other to understand what the other is saying. Trusting the other, says Gadamer, is more important than any form of control. He says, and I quote, there is no doubt that trust can be abused. Wherever people show trust, the abuse of trust also occurs. But wherever trust is shown, trust is also rewarded. End of quote. Trust, in fact, creates the condition for understanding. It is one of those elements which makes possible that, in Chomsky's words, what one of them says, the other can understand. By trust, Gadamer meant engaging in dialogue with other thinkers and other ways of thinking. Trust in language is inseparable from trust in persons. There are many dimensions in language, but one of its primary characteristics is that in whatever language it may be, a word is always spoken and signified by a person. Language, in its proper sense, is spoken only by persons. Gadamer himself has observed that Aristotle described the human being as the animal that has language. Human beings are persons because they are able to move within and outside of themselves. That is, they are endowed with interiority, as demonstrated by their capacity for reflection and self-knowledge, as well as the capacity to transcend their inner selves and see things as others see them. This dual capacity for interiority and transcendence constitute the individual and social dimensions of the human person. What links interior and social worlds, however, is language. With language, human persons are able to express their inner reality. With language, they're able to interact with others, share experiences, and with the language gained from such interaction, are able to deepen their own inner reality. Such is the nature of being human.
Thank you so much, Bishop Villarojo. It is indeed an enlightening and thought-provoking lecture. Your insights have greatly enriched our understanding of the topic. I am sure that the talk of our keynote lecturer has generated insights and questions from our audience. So we will now open the floor for questions, comments, and insights. Before we begin, allow me first to share with you the dynamics of our open forum to maintain an orderly, polite, and enlightening discussion. For on-site participants, you may raise your hand and allow me first to recognize you. You may approach the microphone at the middle, introduce yourself and your affiliation, then you may ask the question to our keynote lecturer. Kindly write your questions on the notepad provided in the registration kits. For online participants, kindly input your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom. The session moderator for Open Forum will read your questions in the plenary session for you. For an order flow of the question and answer, we will have it alternatively. First, we read a question from the Zoom chat box, then we proceed to our participants at the live session. Let us begin, dear chat moderators. Do you have questions from our online participants? From our on-site participants, is there anyone who would like to raise a question to our plenary speaker? Yes, Dr. Sagut.
Morning, Bishop. I'm Joel from the CTRSE. I was intrigued by the point about revision of our understanding of human nature. And I think one of the difficulties of the Catholic tradition was that the Catholic tradition has often been probably mischaracterized as imposing a conception of human nature that has been final and unchanging in such a way that we can hardly develop in our understanding of who we are as human persons. And the point that I got from your presentation is that when we can accommodate that revision, because certainly we improve in our understanding of who we are, but there has to be a threshold of what we can accommodate and up to what extent we could revise. And I was intrigued moreover by the point of the threshold is established by that common understanding. That there has to be a rational language that would allow us to come up with a communal understanding of who we are. My question on the bishop is that sometimes there are instances that we can really hardly understand one another, and then the call is simply to just allow coexistence, to tolerate one another despite not having that understanding. What do you think of that particular ideal in the process of dialogue? Thank you, po.
Yeah, I would like to return again to Gadamer because he makes a distinction between understanding of the text and understanding of the author. Substantive agreement and psychological understanding. when we cannot arrive at substantive agreement, meaning we agree on a particular subject, then we can have a fallback position, which is to understand each other psychologically, and that perhaps is what you meant by, tolerating each other because we are coming from different backgrounds. So while we cannot agree on the subject matter at hand, the propositional content of what we're talking about, at least we can understand each other psychologically. We're coming from different backgrounds and so on and so forth. But that is not the end of it, no? Because when we arrive at a psychological understanding of the other person, it doesn't mean that we just stay there, because the human community transcends all barriers. And when we begin to know each other, that's when our horizons, as Gadamer would call it, our horizons would begin to merge in dialogue, so that the erstwhile psychological understanding we make of each other can actually also lead towards substantive agreement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sagut and Bishop. Um, we can now proceed to another question from the online chat moderators. Do we have one? Still none? How about for the on-site participants? Yes, Dr. Aguas?
Uh, Good morning, Bishop. Job Aguas. I just want to be clarified, Bishop. What do we try to revise here? Our understanding of human nature or human nature itself?
Okay, the title is rather flexible, no? Because it says understanding human nature. It's purposely done that way because we're referring the dialogue between Chomsky and Foucault focuses on human nature in terms of understanding, although they have two different ideas of understanding. That's why we brought it down to Gadamer, who gives us a more detailed presentation of the phenomenon of understanding. So that when we say, what do we really mean by revision of human nature? Is it revising human nature itself as an object, or only revising our understanding of human nature? I'd go towards the middle ground, which is none of both, but touches on both, which means that we look at human nature in terms of understanding. That's why I repeat many times over Chomsky's words, that by which we understand each other. What one of them says, the other can understand. Because human nature is that by which we understand each other. So that understanding is central to the idea of human nature. And I'm not defining here what human nature is. I also am not setting possibilities, but I did say certain limits. But the limit is only to the extent that when we conceive of understanding in a way that is far beyond what the human person is, we will know that we have breached the red line when people cannot understand each other anymore. When we act in a way that others cannot understand us, or it creates dissension and confusion already. That is a breaching of the concept or the understanding of human nature. So it's both who we are, what is our self-understanding, and we act it out in a particular way and see whether my understanding of human nature can be understood by the other. When people push back and say, that's not what human being is, because I don't understand you anymore. And it's a very wide context. So that's an indication that we have breached that dividing line, the limits of what human nature should be.
My follow-up question, Bishop, is have we reached that limit?
Yes. In some instances.
And so we sort of have watered down the human nature in the objective sense.
Not only watered down, but also distorted human nature.
And if I may follow up that question, so what do we do now? I mean,
Okay.
some recommendations.
When we don't understand each other, what do? We try to talk some more and try to clarify, what are you saying? And I also try to clarify myself so that we enter into a dialogue. And perhaps, only perhaps, because we cannot force it on people, they may see things differently. But meanwhile, we who have a clear understanding of what human nature is, you might notice that I did not quote any magisterial document, although towards the latter part, the idea of trust is really from Fides et Ratio. I mean, they have parallel ideas, Fides et Ratio and Gadamer in that respect, the idea of trust. No? But this is something universal. Understanding is universal. It's not only, human nature is universal, just as understanding is universal. And you don't have, you cannot say that I cannot understand you because I'm coming from this particular tradition. Understanding, though sometimes we might find some difficulties due to traditional barriers, is always porous and capable of transcending such barriers. Because in the end, we share a common human nature. And that is one proof that there is a common human nature, that we can still understand each other in spite of the wide-ranging diversities in our traditions.
Thank you very much, Bishop, for the clarifications.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aguas and Bishop. Now for our online participant, here is one of the questions. Bishop, you mentioned that for Gadamer, hermeneutics is not a method of interpretation, but a description of understanding. And Gadamer, it seems, initially described understanding in terms of play, in German, Spey, and aesthetic experience. Do these two, play and aesthetic experience, help enrich our understanding of human nature? Thank you po, Bishop. So that's from
The idea of spiel or play is a kind of analogy for understanding. It's kind of a descriptive analogy of how understanding occurs, no? Because we are used to the idea of hermeneutics as a method with rigid rules that you have to follow in order to arrive at a correct, supposedly correct interpretation. But in the tradition of Schleiermacher, that really is not a correct interpretation, it's divinization. No? Trying to guess what the other is saying, what the intent of the author is. No? So Gadamer says, when we understand, we are not actually playing according to rigid rules. He describes play as not being played by the players themselves, but that in the back and forth movement of the play, say it's a ball or volleyball or basketball, the players are actually being played. Now, of course, there are rules in basketball and any kind of game, but within those rules, and I would say those rules would correspond to the four structures of understanding that somehow schematize our minds when we try to converse with each other. Still, however, in the process of conversation, there are no specific rules to follow to the extent that we already prejudge how the game is to be played. Because when you already determine how the game is to be played, what is that? That's game fixing. And it's not a real game anymore. So that when we talk, when we converse with each other, although we hold on to particular positions initially, holding on to our prejudices and our tradition, we do not predetermine the course of the play or the course of the conversation. We allow the matter to unveil or reveal itself in the course of that conversation that we have. And that recalls back, and that recalls the notion of trust that is necessary when we converse with each other. We do not impose ourselves on the person we are talking with. We learn to trust that what he is saying is sincere. Okay, those are initial movements that we commit ourselves to, hoping that in this process, not only do we get affirmed in our convictions, but that we learn from the other, and perhaps arrive at a better understanding of what we are talking about. And the same also is happens in aesthetic experience. In aesthetic experience, we appreciate a work of art. The work of art is supposedly inert. It doesn't talk, it doesn't say something, it doesn't move, unless if it's a mobile art, no? Or installation art. But all the same, when we appreciate that particular art, it affects us. And it invites us or moves us towards trying to understand what it means and what it is saying to us. So that the work of art now becomes a text that we engage in, a dialogue. Because no matter what, it is still a product of human being. It's an expression of a human person. So that you have the same movement. And this is also analogous to the way we read a particular text. The moment we read a particular text, the text comes alive and engages us in dialogue.
Thank you so much, Sir Alexis Itaw, for that question through Zoom meeting, and Bishop Villarojo. At this moment, we believe that it is now important for us to close this Q&A, and I now call again Mr. Joseph Guillermo.
Thank you, Dr. Ringor, for that moderation of the open forum. To show